right, morning everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce today's colloquium speaker, Professor Kristi Morgansen in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics here at University of Washington. Kristi got her bachelor's and master's in mechanical engineering from Boston University. Then she went to Harvard for a bit. She did her master's in applied math and her PhD in engineering sciences with Roger Brockett, who's a super well-known control theorist. And then she spent a little time as a postdoc and then a research scientist at Caltech, working with Richard Murray and other people on flight and other kinds of nonlinear systems. And then since then, she's been here at UW. Her work is kind of broadly in nonlinear control. She's done a lot of stuff on kind of biological or bio-inspired interfaces with control, with a particular emphasis on state estimation and observability. So let's give Kristi a warm welcome.
Great. All right, thank you, and thank you for inviting me today. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the work that we've been doing in my group on integrated sensing and actuation. And so what that means is how sensing and actuation are coupled together in nonlinear systems. And in particular, I'm going to talk about some of the applications we've been working on in flight. So what I'm showing here in this slide are three images of wings from different insects. And they're fairly small insects, most of them. And then what we're interested in doing is taking some of the principles that we're working with and then applying them both to biological systems and then translating some of the things that we learn over into engineered systems. So in my department, some of the like fixed wing flight or other kinds of air systems. And I should also mention, so this work that I'm going to talk about today is in collaboration with a number of my graduate students. So Atiya and Brian just got their PhDs, as did Nathan, and Abby got her master's, and Jake is still here, so he's working on that. So as a motivator, what I'm showing in this slide is a movie of a bat exodus from a cave in the evening to go out and hunt insects, and this is down in Texas. And what you see here is that it's always a big tourist attraction for people to go and see this. And there are literally thousands of bats coming out of this cave. And what I want to emphasize here is while the bats do know the environment and they know their cave really well, they don't know when, say, some of the tourists stick their arms out into the group of bats, but yet they never fall to the ground from running into things. They're not knocking themselves senseless running into each other. And they're able to do this both in this direction when they're going out and also in the evening or after they finish feeding when they come back in. And so what a number of us are interested in is how is it that these animals are using their sensing in combination with their flight capabilities to achieve these flight performance capabilities that we really cannot do in any sort of manned or even engineered flight system today. Okay, so the key part of that I'm going to talk about for the next little bit here is how animals use sensing and actuation, and this is a different way than what we typically use in engineered systems these days. So these are three different species of flying animals. So we have, well, actually, I think the middle one doesn't actually fly, but some do. So the owl here uses its head movement when it's doing localization of sounds from acoustic signals, so auditory signals. And they do this to locate prey or a variety of different things. Some of our insects use surging and casting behavior when they're flying around to localize either for food or for their mates. And in insects, I'm going to point out a key piece here. So this is a crane fly. Where's my mouse? Here we go. So this little piece right here, this is basically a mass on a rod. It's a vestigial hindwing in certain species of insects. And it serves as it's called a haltere, and it serves as a gyroscope. So it provides rotational acceleration information for the insects. And studies have been done to show that that information does match up with what you get out of a gyroscope. And a key thing about these different modes of sensing that are going on in these animals that are very essential for what they do in their everyday life is that in order to make the sensing work as well as it does, movement of the animal or movement of the environment is necessary. So you can't separate out the capabilities of the sensing from the motion of the animal. Okay, now this is something that we use a little bit currently in engineered systems. It's been used back in the 90s. This is the Aerosonde autonomous vehicle, shown up here in the right. And this is the first aircraft to fly autonomously across the Atlantic Ocean. So it went from Newfoundland down here in the map over to Scotland. And it did that completely without communication while it was flying. And it did it on a lawnmower's worth of gasoline. Now, part of the way that that was managed was that it had very limited sensing on board. So it had GPS measurement information and also differential GPS and a pitot probe for airspeed, but it didn't have a heading measurement that was able to give it wind speed direction. Okay, but yet you need that information in order to get from point A to point B without somebody telling you where you're going. So what they did in order to get that information about how they were drifting from the wind speed was just to periodically do some S-turns and look at the GPS information about how they shifted relative to where they thought they should be on the GPS information. So this particular application was done in an ad hoc way. And what we can do now, this was again done back in the 90s, what we can do now is put some more formal mathematical structure on this, which allows us then to generalize it to broader classes of systems. So I'm going to give you a bit of the mathematics that go into this structure, and then show you how we apply it to some of the biological systems, and then where we can take that with the engineered systems. Okay, so broad picture of what we're looking at here. So observability, this is the ability to take some measurements in a system and extract out the information that you want. So what we have in the system, if you want to think of a system just as a black box, so you've got some inputs that go in. We generally assume that we know what inputs we applied to a system, and then the things that come out are the measurements that we're getting out. Now bear in mind that when you do measurements, the thing that you're measuring is generally going to be subject to a lot of noise. The inputs that you put into the system, they're also going to be affected by noise and disturbances. But the part that we want to focus on here for observability is that the system itself has some properties of interest to us, and those are going to be the X's, so we'll call those our states. And how the states are hooked together in the system along with the measurements in order to give us that information that comes out of the measurements. There's this mapping that we'll call it between the states and the controls that gives us our measurements. And what we'd like to be able to do is come up with an inverse of that relationship. So figure out what is X directly knowing our measurements and the controls. Now, in general, you might say, okay, well, so we've got the measurements going in, and that's great, so we're just going to invert that relationship. So is that all we need? Or is it, in fact, the case in some situations that we're also going to need to incorporate whatever information we have about the inputs for the system? Excuse me. And so for those of you who are familiar with linear systems, you probably know that for a linear system, it doesn't matter what inputs you put into the system. All you need to know are the measurements, and from that information, you can invert the relationship. If you're going to be able to invert the relationship, you can do it without the controls. Okay. As it turns out, though, for nonlinear systems, and particularly some of the more effective ones, more agile or more maneuverable systems that we're going to look at today, you actually need to know both the control and the measurement. Okay, and they're going to be coupled together in particular ways. And then what we want to do with that from an engineering point of view is not just have a black box that says, okay, well, can I figure out what my states are? Often you want to have some desired behavior for your system. And so this is sort of a rewriting of our classic block diagram for feedback in a controlled system. So we have some estimator that we then build based on the measurements that extracts out the information for our states and compares that to the desired behavior, and then that determines what the control for the system will do and how the inputs will be generated. So a key thing I want to point out today, what I'm going to be talking about is not actually the design of the estimators. That's going to be completely independent, well, not completely independent, but a separate discussion than is it even possible to build that estimator? Okay, so that's the part that I'm going to talk about today. What are the things that need to happen for the estimation to happen, to be effective? Okay, so a little bit of math. So for linear systems, this is a standard linear system model that I'm showing up here. So standard linear system up here, so it's an n-dimensional system for the state, and we're assuming that we have some number of measurements y and some inputs u. And I didn't mark up there, the u's could be either scalar or vector version. And what we're going to do, we're going to start off, I'm going to look at the measurements for the system. So y is just equal to cx. I'm going to fill in this structure here with derivatives of the output. So if we just start taking derivatives, so this is our first derivative, working in the effects of the dynamics of the system. So the 1 there just represents the number of derivatives. Do that a second time, and then just keep on doing that. And there are results out there that say we only need to do this up to technically n-1 derivatives. But if we stack all of this together into this matrix structure here, so the things over here on the left, these are all our measurements and our derivatives of them. So we assume that those are known. We do have to assume that they're differentiable or that we can come up with some sort of an approximation for the derivatives. The pieces over here, again, we assume that we know the controls that we put into the system, and then also that we know something about the structure. And there are some things you can do to loosen that up when we're working in this kind of a context, but for now, assume that we know all of those pieces. The only thing we don't know is the state. And so in order to extract that, the key thing in this structure is just that this matrix right here, this just needs to be full rank. Okay, so it doesn't have to be square, but it does need to be full rank for us to find an inversion between the information that we have and the states x that we want to get. Okay, so this is the standard linear result that's called the separation principle for measurements and control. So we don't need the controls in order to get the extraction of the states out. However, in nonlinear systems, if we go through that exact same process of taking derivatives, so what I'm showing up here, this is a standard control affine nonlinear system format. So you can't write all nonlinear systems in this, but a good number of them we can. So this is the drift in our system. These are our control terms right here and how they are incorporated into the dynamics, so the input vector fields. And then I'm just going to lump this whole thing together and call it f with no subscript on it. So you'll see that appear down here a little bit. And then we have our measurements for the system. And here I'm going to assume that there's scalar measurements, but you can generalize this out to however many measurements you want. I just did this for readability in the equations. So when we take the derivatives here, and I just listed them all out, so we have the first one, just as we did with the linear system, only here now, the relationship between the states and that measurement is a nonlinear function. It's not a linear relationship. We can't just pull the x out. We can rewrite that as a directional derivative. This is also referred to as a Lie derivative. And when we stack all of these together, when you work through all of these relationships for the derivatives of your outputs, you can find that there is this relationship between directional derivatives and this h of x. So it's not now that we have something multiplying x, but something operating on h of x, on your actual measurement function. And a key thing here with this relationship is that this set of things, so going back to, excuse me, going back to the diagram I had shown, this is that relationship between the model and the measurements that you have and the input. So this g function that we want to invert. Okay, and again, so this is not necessarily, if it were the case that the inputs didn't matter, we'd be able to write this whole relationship just in terms of the f naught. So all these derivatives we'd be able to express in terms of the f naught, but that's not the case for many nonlinear systems. Okay, so walking through that. So we need to be able to find some, at least local inversion of this relationship. It's not going to be as simple usually as a matrix inversion, but a similar kind of thing. Okay, so the way that we do it for a nonlinear system, in general, we're not going to be able to come up with a global inversion of that relationship. So one thing that we can do, and that is typically done, is just to do a local Jacobian of that g function. So just take a set of partials with respect to x and look at whether or not that matrix is invertible, and is it invertible at all of the places in your state space. Okay, so if it turns out that you can do that, we will refer to that system as observable. And some key things about this situation that we are interested in looking at is in the situation where where the answer depends on the particular controls that you choose, what characteristics of those controls are going to make your observability either feasible at all, or you can also think about it as what's going to make your system most observable. So we can start to talk about degrees of observability. So it's not going to be just a yes or no kind of thing. And then we could also sort of flip that problem around and say, well, if we just left the controls alone and made sure that if we need them, that they're there, how can we play with things in terms of sensor placement to get the best information about our system? And you can, that particular problem, you can also ask it very similarly for linear systems. OK, so if we apply this back to the Arason problem, which again, the original use of this approach was done in an ad hoc way for the system, and it worked very well. It got across the Atlantic. So here's a very simple model of that airplane. So this is just what's referred to as a unicycle model. So we just have planar representation, so x and y for the center of mass of the vehicle, and then a heading angle theta. We'll assume it's at a constant altitude. And then we're also going to work in there the wind speed, so how that affects the motion of the aircraft. And the only thing that we're going to be controlling here is going to be the heading rate. So we're assuming it's flying at a constant velocity, constant altitude. The velocity is v. And then the wind is the wx and wy. And that's what we want to be able to figure out so that we can compensate for it. And the measurements here, again, coming off GPS, are just going to be the x and the y. And so it turns out, if you go through the analysis, I didn't show the math here, but we could go through and walk back through it. If you do the math on this system, you will not be able to come up with an observable system if the control inputs are just constant. So if you're just flying in a straight line and not changing your heading. It does turn out, though, that if you look at what's necessary, so you do have to have a control in there. And so it'll turn out from the analysis that you need to have a term in there where the control is doing something, where it's being active. And out of that analysis, it doesn't say specifically what's the best thing to do with the control, just that something needs to be happening in order for you to even be able to have an estimator lock on to the correct answer. So it turns out if you put in cyclic inputs, that's definitely one way of exciting that term, which is what was done in these S turns for the system. And so if you look at this with, this is for an unscented Kalman filter applied to the system. So on the left here, what happens when you have constant inputs. And so you can see the first, one of the two directions will lock on. So you can get the east-west wind direction, but not the north-south wind direction. But as soon as we put in some sort of cyclic motion like these S turns, then you lock right on to the actual correct value. Now, I will also point out, so one of the things about observability and estimation, so observability tells you whether or not the estimator is going to work. But clearly, if you can build an estimator that works, the system was observable, as long as you believe your results. But what we can do with the observability is come up with more effective ways of designing our estimators, or things that we know that we need to build into them. OK, so some of the challenges, though, with the approach that I just showed you in terms of doing this analysis for the nonlinear observability, we do assume that we have analyticity of the model, so that we have all of our functions, and that all of these derivatives are going to exist. And that can be a real challenge when you start getting into more complex functions or things where your model isn't smooth. So it's not as pretty as some of these examples I showed you. And then also complexity of the models. So as your order of your state gets even above a small number, so something around 10 states can be really difficult to try and do the calculations for the observability in these systems. So one of the things that a number of people have been working on over the last few years, and us included, is a method that's based not on analysis of the system, but more of an empirical approach. And so what is being done with this is based on the idea of doing a linearization about a trajectory. So if we take our nonlinear system and take a nominal trajectory. This does assume, so now we're trading off complexity of the functions and analyticity for knowing something about a nominal trajectory for the system, something it can feasibly do, both the path that it's going to follow as well as the controls that it needs to do that. We can linearize the system around that nominal trajectory, and in general, you'll end up with a time-varying linear system. And then with that time-varying linear system, we can go through and calculate observability from the linear point of view by using what's called the observability gradient. And so this is an idea here that's based on looking at your output energy for the system. So we're just going to integrate the outputs over a certain amount of time. And when you put this together down here in this integral here, these initial conditions will pop out on either side. So this x naught is the thing that you're trying to find. So you're going to measure for a certain period of time and then extract out the information from the beginning of the time period. And in order to solve this equation, we just need that matrix W, which is square, to be invertible. So again, what we've done here is we're going to trade off the complexity of the functions for a linearization. And sort of embedded in that linearization will be our control function. So you may have to be somewhat selective about how you set that up. And then as long as we can invert that matrix, then everything's going to be good. Now, what I've shown here is still an analytic result, but it turns out you can take this approach and run simulations for your system rather than doing an actual analytical integration of the results. And so if you take your nominal trajectory as well as the nominal controls that generated it, put them into your simulation, and it turns out you can either do it in the simulation, and as long as you satisfy certain constraints, which I'm going to leave that a little bit vague, you could do it with a physical system as well. You could just run a trajectory, and then look at the output that you get. And then the thing that we need to do on top of this in order to put together the full matrix is we're going to perturb our initial conditions over here for the system using the same control, but perturb them in particular ways about each of the basis directions. So you need to make sure you've got a plus or minus epsilon on there, and then keep track of the trajectories that come out for each of those perturbations. So you'll end up running 2n simulations, stack all of those together into this object right here, and this is what's referred to as the empirical observability Gramian. And so it turns out we just need this particular thing to be invertible in order to guarantee that we have observability for our system. Okay, so what I'm going to do with this now, so we were not the ones that developed all this. We've done some things in my group to generalize building in some perturbations on the control and some other things that I'll talk about a little bit later. But I'm going to show you now how we can apply these ideas to some studies in biological systems and use those to leverage some information for what we can do a little bit better in engineered systems. So here's a big chart of a bunch of different animal species as well as a few engineered systems. And what I want you to take away from this picture is the key thing we're going to be looking at here is for any sort of a sort of thematic bit of information about how sensing is used in a variety of species. So across species, are there some common traits for how sensing is being set up for particular things? And what I've got on here, there's a mix of insects, birds, and one mammal. And if you look across the bottom axis here, get my pointer back. So this is actuation rate. And so for the biological things, think of that as the wing beats per second. So how many wing beats they can do in a second. And so obviously as you get to these smaller insects like the Drosophila and the honeybee, they're flapping very quickly. Whereas things like a bat are not flapping quite as quickly. So they're running around, they're flapping about 10 times a second. The flying things, the engineered things here, these have been sort of normalized. It's a little tougher to think about these in particular, but I wanted to get a few of them on the page here in terms of sort of how fast their motor speed is, so how quickly you're going to be able to affect that. And then over here on this axis, this is how quickly the animals can respond to sensed information relative to changing their actuation. So up here, these insects, it takes several wing beats before they can do anything in response to a change in what they're sensing. So it takes them around 10 wing beats before they can do anything. So they're not going to be able to do anything in terms of changing the shape of the wing beat in response to something, as opposed to a bat, which gets about 10 observations per wing beat. So they can change the shape of their wing beat mid-beat in response to what's going on. Okay, so the three that I'm going to focus on here in the next little bit are going to be the Drosophila, which is the fruit fly up here. So it's a tiny little thing. The honeybee, which is this one, and then a hawk moth, which is sort of in the middle. So hawk moths, if you haven't seen them, they're fairly beefy. And this work is in collaboration with a number of biologists. So the Drosophila data is coming from Michael Dickinson's group. The honeybee data comes from Jason Vance's group at College of Charleston. And then the hawk moth information comes from primarily here at UW. in Tom Daniels' group. Okay, so we're looking at maximizing sensing, or looking at what can we do with sensing in these insects. And so here's what the hawk moth is doing is it's flying along, and it's feeding actually at this point, so it's got its proboscis into a bit of nectar there. And if you look over here, this is on the right. Assuming my mouse will behave itself. Hello, mouse. Okay, so the wings over on the right, if you look at them closely, there are some little blue dots on here. These are what are called campaniform sensilla on the wings. They are believed, among other things, to encode strain in the wings. Now, hawk moths have about 200 or so of these on each wing, so that's a lot of strain sensors, which if you compare that to what we do in engineered systems, we have very few sensors that are much more complex. So these are pretty simple, and there are lots of them. There's still a lot not known about how they work. What's not shown on here, there's a huge number of them down here at the root of the wing where it attaches to the body. And one of the questions that we're going to look at here next is what we can do with those sensors, like what is it that they're capable of giving us in terms of information. So if you take strain information, what you will see here in a little bit is that you can actually turn that into gyroscopic information about the animals. We'll be able to get body rotation accelerations just from this information coming off of the wings, as long as we actuate them correctly. And then we're also going to look a little bit at where are the best places to put the sensors. And so we'll do this with an engineering study with this math that we've got here. And what will come out of that, one of the nice things that we're interested in coming out of that is how well does that match up? So if we look at this study, are we able to predict some of the locations? And therefore, is that maybe telling us some information about what's going on in terms of usage of these kinds of sensors for biological flight? And then maybe we could use that for engineered flight. Okay, so some of the key things that we're going to need in order to do this. First, I'm going to come at this from the modeling point of view, from the analytical point, and see what we can get out of that. And that'll give us our gyroscopic information, and then we'll look at the optimal sensor placement using the numerical approach, the empirical approach. Okay, so this is the model we're going to work with. And this is, in fact, a reduced order model. We're working with mode shapes here. So the etas are going to be mode shapes for our system, and then their time derivatives are the eta dots. So that's going to be our states, in addition to the PQ and R are going to be the angular rotation rates for our system, for the main body of the animal. And so the conventions for those are down here. So there's a feathering angle, an elevation angle, and a stroke angle. What those look like in terms of your dynamics are shown here. So there's, get the mouse out of the way. So we have a stiffness matrix, that's information about stiffness properties in the wing. We have our mass matrix, again, that's coming out of mass properties for the wing as well as for the body. And then down here, the things that we're going to be measuring, we're going to be assuming right now that we're going to measure all of the mode shapes for the system, and that's actually going to get mapped over to strain. And from that, the things that we are specifically not measuring are these rotation rates. So we want to know, can we get those? And I should also mention these particular mode shapes right here. These are the first bending and the first torsion mode shapes, and that's coming off of a cantilever model, cantilever beam model. I'll compare that to some FEA ones here in a little bit. Okay, so if we take that model and do the analysis, so again, I'm going to sweep all the math under the rug here. You can pull it out of the papers if you'd like. If we look at the analysis of the observability, the analytical approach to observability for the system. And so here, these F naughts, if you remember way back, that corresponded to just the drift, so no control. So if you don't control the system, if there's no wing flapping and no motion of the system, then you do not get a system that's observable, in the sense of we would not be able to extract out the body rotation rates. But if we do actuate the system, and so here, this FI right here showing up means that we need some actuation in there, then we will end up with a full rank local approximation to our observability. And this FI here, this just means that we need to have some body rotation going on in the animal. So as long as its body is rotating in one way or another, you'll be able to extract out the rotation rates, which sort of makes sense. If it's not rotating, you wouldn't want to be able to extract it. And one way of exciting that is if you just take the natural wing beat of the insect, this is for the hawk moth again, and so this is that wing beat pattern that was shown as it was feeding there, I believe. This is enough to excite the motion of the animal, to have it flapping around there, and get this system to be observable. So you'd be able to extract out gyroscopic forces, gyroscopic information. Okay, so that's the analytical side. And now we can turn over and look at this from the empirical side. And again, the question is going to be, okay, so now we know we can extract this information, but where's the best place to put the sensors to get that information? So you can make it easier or harder depending on where you put your sensors to get your information. So this is the setup we have to work with in order to do the empirical approach. Okay, so we need a nominal trajectory, and that is going to be partly coming out of the stroke kinematics for the animal. So this is the controls that are going in, and this is coming off of measured data. We need the material properties for the system, so for the wing itself, and this is coming off of actual studies of hawk moth wings. We're going to take our wing mode shapes, and this right here is showing, actually this is showing the mode shapes from the previous slide, which was the cantilever beam model, but we can also put in mode shapes from finite element analysis, and I'll show some results specifically for a number of those in a little bit here. And then we're going to assume that we have quasi-steady aerodynamics. Now the fact that we're working with fairly rigid wings makes that a reasonable approximation. There's also been some studies done, particularly in Tom Daniels' group, showing that that's a reasonable thing to do in this kind of an application. And then here's what'll come in. So we do the simulated flapping. And so we're going to put in the controls and then keep track of the measurements. Sorry, I don't know why that's not tracking there. Of the system, and we're going to stack those up and build our empirical observability gradients. We're going to need to run 2n simulations for each setup that we want to check for measurements, for placement of the sensors. Okay, so here are the mode shapes of, we do this across a number of species. We're going to do the same thing for the honeybee and for the Drosophila and sort of compare what's going on. So I just want to show the mode shapes at this point that would go into it. A key point to note here, the bending modes, whether we use the cantilever beam or the FEA, and the FEA was done in ANSYS, I forget how many elements were in there, with the assumption of, so there were shell elements and homogeneous properties of the wing. So we could talk about that later for generalizing it. The shear modes come out different between the cantilever model and the FEA. So that's just something to be aware of when we look at the results. And then these two were also done for FEA. And you'll notice here, like these are fairly consistent in what these are the first bending and the first shear mode, what they look like for each of the animals with the wing. And this is, if you look very closely in here, you'd be able to see the mesh structure of that. That's the actual FEA. Okay, so that's going to give us the mode shapes, again, that go into this box right here. We have material properties. These are all measured. The wing stroke information is all coming off of measured biological data, and then the aerodynamics are assumed to be somewhat similar to the rigid body model, so we're assuming that the wings are fairly rigid. Okay, and then we're going to look at doing some optimization. So this up here, this is just the approximation of our function g here. We're doing our first term, our linear term on that. That's what we're going to be looking at needing to be full rank. It turns out you can compare that. It is, in some sense, is correlated with the estimation covariance if you look at the inverse of it. And so the dy transpose dy, this linear approximation here, that's effectively just the empirical gradient for the system. And we look at a variety of different measures. So when we do an optimization, you have to have some function that you're optimizing. The various ones that people, including my group, have looked at, so you can look at maximizing your estimation uncertainty, minimizing it, or what makes it minimum or maximum. And that comes down to your eigenvalues of the system. You can look at the shape of the uncertainty ellipsoid and try and make that a consistent shape, try and make it spherical. So if you minimize the kappa there. You can look at the volume of it, so try and minimize the volume of it, so minimizing the uncertainty that way, or doing overall just average estimation uncertainty. Okay, there are other metrics you could use as well. These are just some of the typical ones. Okay, so with that, we can plug this into an optimization problem. So here's the structure that we're going to use for the problems I'm going to show you. And this generalizes to a variety of other kinds of applications as well. So just make sure my computer's got the right time. Okay. So these are the dynamics. So we're assuming that we have a control affine system, at least for the purposes of just walking through this optimization. In reality, we can relax the analyticity here a good bit. And we're going to assume that our measurements for our system are going to be parametrized by some terms SI here. And we're going to assume these SIs just come from some set, and I'll show you a picture of that on the next slide here. What these are going to be for the systems we're looking at is sensor locations. And we're going to assume that we have a variety of options for where the sensors can go, and they can also have different types that they take on. And what we're interested in doing is saying which of these, if we limit the number of them, where should we choose the positions to be? And we'll assume we have any number of measurements that we want. So we're going to look at optimizing this problem right here. So doing a minimization over the sensor positions and a little bit on the functions. Okay, we're going to relax that a bit just to make it feasible to do it. So first of all, we're going to assume that the sensor values are going to just be on or off. So it's going to be an integer type problem. And we're going to have two sensor types here. We're going to have shear and bending. So we're going to assume that our sensors are either doing shear sensing or they're doing bending sensing or they're off. And so we're going to grid up our space. Now here I've drawn just an actual regular grid. The structure that we'll have on the wings, we're going to take the actual campaniform sensilla locations on the wings. In addition to, we're going to constrain the sensor locations to lie on the vanes in the wings, because that's where they always are on the animals for obvious reasons. They need data to flow and such. And then we're going to look at how many of them we can limit ourselves to and get decent information out. So if we look at this here, so we're going to say we're going to limit ourselves to a total of P sensors, total of P of both types, and they can take on values either on or off. And the two different types. And you can generalize that if you would like to. It holds for a variety of settings. Okay, and then just to make sure that we promote some sparsity here, we're going to add a penalty on the number of them again. So that's the L1 norm there. So we're going to minimize this function here. And then we relax it out a little bit more, and so we can look at how the number of sensors relates to how observable the system is. So as you'd expect, so this is now unobservability on the metric here. The more sensors you have, the more observable the system is, and conversely. Okay, so this is the mode shapes again for the cantilever system. And so this is looking at, to get the body rate information, what are the best sensors for giving us that body rate? Okay, so we ran through a bunch of different sensors here and said, okay, if we wanted to get X rotation, Y rotation, or Z rotation, look at where the information is coming from, either from the shear or the bending. So again, flip off between those two different types of sensors. It turns out that your shear strain sensors are the ones that are going to give you more information about the gyroscopic information. The bending ones don't give quite so much. And again, this result is done for the cantilever model, just to make it a straight-off comparison with the analytical results. Okay, so here's how that looks on the wing. So where the shear and the bending fall out if we're doing that optimization. So looking at maximizing the information that we're getting out in terms of the gyroscopic measurement. Okay, the optimal sensors here, it turns out, fall into sort of two clusters. So this is looking at, I believe, 20 sensors if you count them up. And so the bending ones tend to give us the best information down at the root of the wing, which makes certain sense. And again, this is done for the cantilever mode shapes. And then these are where the shear sensors started falling out. So they're, in fact, kind of matching up fairly well with a number of the locations here of the sensors along the edge of the wing, on the tip of the wing. The square boxes are where the physical sensors are on the animal. And these are not all of them. There are more. Okay. So that's, if we keep filling them in, they'll sort of start filling in along this pattern here. So it looks like, at least for this model of the mode shapes, the sort of outboard locations here are giving us, the sensors are giving us more about shear information, and the ones in here are giving us more about bending. Okay, so extending this now out to our other animals to look at what might be some consistent themes here. So here's the information for the original cantilever, just for comparison. So we're going to do the same thing with the same number of sensors, so 20 sensors. We actually, well, I'll put it up here. Okay, so here's the information. This is for the FEA model. So just remember here the shear mode here, the bending, the torsion mode here is a different shape between these two things. The bending is very similar. And so the bending locations, the bending sensor locations come out in very similar locations between these two studies here. But with this change in the mode shape for the shear information, we now have the sensors falling out on the leading edge of the wing, so right along here. Okay, and then we have one that's overlapping right here. Okay, so we can actually start thinking about, well, it may be that some of these sensors are serving more than one purpose in this kind of a framework. And then if we do this for the same kind of approach with this is the honeybee data here, so the honeybee wing. And so remember, these mode shapes, they have a structure that's very similar to the hawk moth here. But in this case, the bending sensors are coming out more along the trailing edge of the wing, and the shear ones are coming out more at the root of the wing. And I don't think we have the actual, we're still waiting for our colleagues to provide some SEM data on where the actual sensors are on that wing. And then here's the Drosophila. So sorry, the little boxes are a little small here. But you're seeing, again, these two are fairly comparable. The bending sensors are coming in at the root of the wing, and the shear are coming out along the leading edge. Now the shape of these two, these two are similar shape. This one's a bit different in how it looks. And then one of the interesting things I think here is that the Drosophila is really quite a bit smaller and operating at a much higher wing beat frequency than the hawk moth. The hawk moth is a much larger insect, and if you remember back to the chart, it's sort of in the middle of the chart, and the honeybee and the Drosophila are off in the upper area. Okay, so what we're doing with this right now, so we're looking at extending this. So the models, again, for the FEA that we've done, they didn't include any different properties for the wing veins. They were uniform wing thickness, uniform materials, and we assumed that the wings were not compliant. Now, where we're wanting to go with the compliant surfaces is to include some studies of some of these other animals. So, for example, some of the bats, see what we can do with the bats. These were all done for a particular wing stroke. Okay, so this is one pattern of wing stroke. It was for one, sort of hovering flight. We haven't done this yet for other kinds of flight to see what might come out in terms of different sensor locations, depending on what the animal is doing. And the results here, we're assuming that all of the information that's coming in is being used at the same time, whereas it may be that different things are going on in the wing at different points in the cycle of the wing stroke or at different, just different times. Now, some of the things that we are also interested in looking at, so beyond just the strain in the wing, so we were looking here at strain in the wings and then also the gyroscopic effects. Looking at can we sense, or how well can we sense vorticity in the flow around a wing, also for gust loading of a wing. And so I'm showing that this is a flexible model of an aircraft here. And how we can then translate this out to do a better job with flight for our engineered systems. And I'm showing this for a more of a commercial airliner here, but we can do this for a variety of systems, including UAVs and things like that. Okay, we've done a little bit of this for the fixed wing situation. So I'm going to summarize a whole lot of information on one slide here. If you do a study of looking at where should you put vorticity sensors around, or pressure sensors, they map together, pressure sensors around a wing foil here, and do this in pairs on the top and the bottom, in terms of getting the best information about sensing vorticity. So this is the estimating vorticity here in flow behind a wing foil, and the foil here is flapping. It turns out that the best place to put those sensors is right at the trailing edge if you're trying to get information about the flow behind you. The answer is a little bit different if you want to get it at different places. And that actually matches up. There are similar sensors to pressure sensors. They're more strain sensors again, but on trailing edges of bats. So we have some colleagues that we're working with at Johns Hopkins, technically, to look at this kind of study. And so this is some of the directions we want to go. So the surfaces here are compliant, so they're no longer going to probably satisfy the simplified aerodynamics that we had in the system. The surfaces are going to be compliant here. They're going to be changing much faster within the wing stroke than the insects do. But we think we can make some progress there. Now we can also generalize these results and use them for working with a variety of different systems. This is one right here that we've done a little bit of work with. This is for an underwater system operating off of a ranging beacon. So you can either do it with ranging or so distance or angle to a beacon, to a single beacon. And it'll turn out when you look at this, so here we're flipping it around, and the question now is, what path should you follow? So you could think of that as the mode of actuation is the motion of the system. So it's not for the sensors on board, but relative to an external sensor, what should you do in order to get the best information from that sensor? It turns out straight paths are not your best friend there, but some curvy paths are. And this has some implications for how should you move a system, or how are systems moving, in particular something like potentially the casting behavior in insects that are doing chemosensing in terms of maneuvering through the environment. And then further generalizations beyond that, we can look at things like, instead of the sensors being a group of sensors on a vehicle, you could think of the vehicles in a group as being distributed sensors, and how should you do sampling of those in order to get the most information about a system. So one place that we've looked at this is doing sensing of spread of epidemics in a large community. So how many people do you need to test in order to know that you've got a good handle on what's going on? You can flip that around and say, okay, well, if it's not that I want to get the most information, how do I prevent information? So that's a network security kind of question, or a motion camouflage kind of thing. And then in terms of generalization to stochastic systems, it turns out that in systems where you need some motion in order for the observability to be feasible, in certain systems you can use stochastic effects, so noise types of effects, to stimulate that, get the excitation in the system in order to make it observable, so under certain constraints. Okay, so right up against the time here, so I'm going to thank the various sponsors involved here, as well as all the students who've been involved. And if you want more information, there's our lab website. Oh, and sorry, apologies to Intel and NSF for merging their logos there. All right, thank you.
Thanks very much, Kristi. Are there any questions from the audience? Anybody brave enough to speak up in the big room? So I wondered if you could just talk for a second about what it's like to work at this interface between engineering and biology, and any like specific challenges you found in your work, or maybe just more broadly.
Well, I think it's fun to work at the intersection of different disciplines. The challenge, I mean, I think there's lots and lots of interesting problems there, and I think you can learn a lot from the different disciplines. They can each translate things across. But there is a lot of time involved in just getting a common language set up. So there's, there are different approaches to how studies are done, and even just the words that you use for the same thing. So you have to invest some time, but I think it's definitely well worth it.
So you're saying they haven't all taken differential geometry and things like that?
No. Yeah. Or just, we just have different words for, like elastic collision was one that came up many years ago when I was talking to some biologists.
Interesting. Are there any other questions? All right, well, let's thank Kristi again.